You shall not do to your neighbor anything that you would not want them to do to you. Not even the Shema, thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. But then we have Jesus, who comes along and with this simple explanation just says, what is the greatest commandment? What is it that if I know this, everything else will work out? And he quoted two pieces of scripture. The first from Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. The Lord is God and the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And then he quoted Leviticus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's in these texts that one finds, in drawing on these very core texts of Judaism, that one finds some incredibly resonant messages. The Deuteronomy text, if you ever visit the home of an Orthodox Jew, you will see that the mezuzah that they mark their doorways with, that as they walk from room to room, there's a little brass fixture on the frame of the door that they reach up that declares and reminds the Lord is God, the Lord alone. It is so core to the idea of what it is to be a person of faith, that the Lord is God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And that becomes a cornerstone as Moses is guiding the people, and they're just about to enter the promised land, and he's instructing them, what is it that we must do so that we can live in God's good graces? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And this is the cornerstone of conscience, of your life and faithfulness. And then Jesus quotes Leviticus. Again, in those early days, it's in some ways that he's drawing on what many call the holiness code. It's an expansion on the Ten Commandments, an explanation, taking it into greater detail. And he reads or he recites this line that thou shalt love your neighbor as yourself. This line that Hillel thought that everything else was, that was the core of the Torah, and if you understood that, everything else derived simply from that call to love your neighbor as yourself. And if you go back and look, Leviticus is not the most popular book in the Bible to read. One seminary instructor was saying that the comment of a student in their paper that this was the quickest way to fall asleep at night was to read Leviticus. And yet in this 19th chapter, you find this description of, well, what does that mean? How do we go about living this life? And there are all kinds of juicy tidbits of advice, not necessarily commandment, the commentators say, not an obligation, but the advice that as you're confronted with situations, it talks about the harvest. That when you're harvesting, when you're bringing in, whether it's the fruit of the field or the fruit of the vine, that you never harvest out to the edge to the field. You always leave gleanings. You never take everything out. You always leave something that the poor may live. A stunning kind of thought. He says, you shall reprove your neighbor. How many of you like to reprove your neighbors? Is this something? And yet you shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself by letting your neighbor perpetuate some injustice, some indignity. You become complicit in their action unless you somehow manage to challenge, to be a faithful and loyal friend who says you're out of bounds right now. Or it may be that you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge. Actually, the rabbis comment on the bearing of a grudge at great length. They talk about that if you go to somebody one day and say, can I borrow, they'd use the example of a scythe, a tool, some kind of instrument. Can I borrow your hoe, your rake, can I borrow some eggs? And they say no. But then they come to you the next day and say, can I borrow? What would you do? Most typically, probably you say, no, I'm not going to lend you this stuff. I remember what you did yesterday. Aha, they say. No, you should give him the scythe, the hoe, the shovel, the egg. Thou shalt not bear a grudge against your neighbor. Or later in the chapter, when an alien resides with you, when an immigrant, a refugee is in your midst, you shall not oppress that person. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus speaks to a broad range of things that speak to us today. But is Jesus challenged to summarize the most important message that the Bible would have to offer, that the Torah would offer? It says, these are the two things. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, or in the Greek, in the New Testament, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. He blends these two, and what is so striking and compelling as I read it this year is how otherly oriented he's calling us to be. You know, it begins, you're not the middle of the story. It's not about you, he's saying. This life, this holy life, this faithful life is about God and how you relate to God and your neighbor and how you are called into a relationship with your neighbor. And spirituality, it's not the spiritual person, the attentive person is one who is not consumed with oneself, but rather is reaching out and engaging, allowing God to engage them. And so they do it in different ways, not only as Leviticus would have it, but in Deuteronomy. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away. When you lie down and when you rise, bind them as a sign to your head and your hand, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Keep these things in front of you. Don't forget them. Don't lay them aside where they can gather dust and have no value. We've talked about Leviticus, but we can also look at how Paul and his people in Thessalonians are talking about what it means to live the holy life, the faithful life, this God-centered life, the life that is centered on others. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals. As the election draws near, that's worth noting. But we are gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. We are bound together. We do not stand alone. We are linked to each other as God and human and as brother and sister, friend and alien. We are bound together, and in gentleness, with forgiveness and patience and respect and love and concern. We strive to move forward together. That is holiness. That is faithfulness. That is how do we derive what it is we're supposed to do when we love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and strength, and when we love our neighbor as ourselves. Luther, talking about where this might fit in, we are free, although Christians are thus free from all works. We are not obligated or bound to anything. In fact, the freeing reading of this scripture is that when Jesus says, these are the important things, everything else is derivative. Think about it. Figure it out. What do you do? How do you do it? Although Christians are thus free from all works, from the obligatory task that others may seek to impose on you, they ought in this liberty to empty themselves, take upon themselves the form of the servant, be made in human likeness, be found in human form, and serve, help, and in every way deal with their neighbors as they see that God, through Christ, has dealt and still deals with them. In this Reformation Day, the gospel is that the Lord is God, and the Lord alone. And he's your God. He's your God. God comes to you to be yours. That's gospel. But with reformation and transformation that spills out from the gospel, that comes with this idea that we are perpetually to pursue those things that bring honor to God and compassion to our neighbor. We are challenged to live lives that are rich in the gospel, set free, free to serve, and to do so faithfully. This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God.